Hey guys, so today we got a controller sent in from a player from Kentucky, and he's basically reporting that his controller has snapback issues. The analog stick is really loose, like he's complaining that like it's basically just sagging down. So he wants his box replaced. He wants a snapback mod, and he just basically wants the controller cleaned also. So for today, we're just gonna do that for him, and I'm gonna show you how I do that. You gotta show you the process, what to do and what not to do, and give you a quick tour of my little setup that I use for doing this kind of stuff. So let's get started. This is my setup right here. That's my soldering station. It's the Hacko FX951. That's my DC power supply, flux, controller stuff, wireless adapter. This is my oscilloscope. It's a Rigel 1054Z. This is my fume extractor, the little station where like all the stuff happens. This is my microscope that I use. This is used for like certain projects. For this kind of stuff, I don't need to use it, so I just put it to the side. But let's say like I'm doing like an LED mod or some kind of like repair, I'll definitely use this because it helps out a lot. Like this thing is like amazing. Highly recommend this company. This is just everything else. Some LEDs on the side. So as usual, we're just gonna start by unscrewing the controller. Just gonna speed up this part because I'm pretty sure everyone knows how to do this. If not, there's plenty of tutorials on here on YouTube on how to do this stuff. So right now I'm just gonna take a look at the PCB board. You can see that it looks pretty clean. Honestly, like I don't even think the controller is that dirty. But right now I'm just gonna take out the analog stick and take a look at the stick box. Quickly examine it, see how it looks like. Honestly, it doesn't look that dirty, or even like that really used. But I have to like do what the person asked for. As you can see here, I'm just quickly inspecting the insides, looking to make sure how it looks like. Looks perfectly fine to me. So we're gonna get started by removing it now, and we're going to get started with the removal process. So right now what I'm going to do is I'm going to apply some rosin flux paste. My go-to company is MG Chemicals. Honestly, I've never experienced any kind of problem with MG Chemicals. They are a little bit more pricier, maybe by like $1 or $2, but honestly, with this kind of stuff, you want to go for the best quality things so you can get the job done better, more efficiently, and more cleaner. So right now what I'm doing is I'm just applying some flux paste onto the metal pins, the silver pins, sorry, it's just the silver pins. I'm applying the flux paste onto there. Flux allows the solder to stick onto the pins itself and not like anywhere else. It makes it much more cleaner, it makes it much more easier. I highly recommend you use flux. A lot of people sometimes when they begin soldering, they don't use flux, and they don't understand how much it's like almost impossible to do soldering without flux. So right now I'm just taking a strong look at the pins, making sure that there's plenty of flux on there. I don't care. I oversaturated with flux. Flux is always good. Flux is the best. Flux is your best friend. Flux will help you get through life. Flux right now is just, again, like I'm just applying it, all of it, and I'm going to show you how it looks like right now. So you can see here a lot of flux, especially on all those 10 pins that are about to be desoldered. Make sure like it's oversaturated, it's nice, it's condensed in there. You know, don't worry about getting it all over the place. We can clean that up later. Just make sure that it's on those pins so that it can work out better in the end for you. This is the solder wick that I use. I got it from Amazon. It's a bit more on the expensive side, but the good thing is that it's good quality. And when you're doing this kind of stuff, especially when you're doing it for people, you want to use the best quality stuff to make sure that it doesn't mess up the components or it makes your life just much more harder. So to demonstrate how to use a desolder wick, you're gonna put the wick on with the pins, like right next to it, but don't put it on top of the pins. What you're gonna do is once you put it next to those 3 pins, you're gonna put the soldering iron on top of the wick. And once you do that, it'll heat up the wick and it'll make it absorb all the solder that's on there. Kind of look like a magnet. Like if you watch it, you'll just see the solder kind of like just go on to those braids. And once the braids get silver, you're gonna cut that off and gonna use a fresh new braid afterwards. So one thing to keep in mind is that when you are doing this, make sure that you're not too aggressive. Just add some pressure, but not too much. Another thing is make sure you don't leave it on there for too long. If you leave it on there for too long, you run the chance of ripping off the pad. And if you rip off the pad, that's going to be a whole different situation. And I'll make a video on how to repair a ripped pad, but for now, let's just focus on getting this solder out. Once you get it out, you should be able to see just the bare traces. Like right there, you see the pad. You'll just see the bare pads, and that's it. Once you just see that, and you can see the pins and the pads, and you see no solder, you know that the job is done, and you can move on to the next parts. So right now, I'm just gonna cut off my soldering braid, and I'm gonna go on to the next part, which is the next 3 pins on the vertical side of the PCB board. Something to keep in mind is that as you're applying your soldering iron to the soldering braid, make sure that you also apply solder wire to the iron, because as you use it with the braid, it's also going to absorb the solder off of the iron, and if there's no solder on the iron, it will make the heat transfer very hard to work. So make sure every time you use it, you apply a little bit of soldering wire to the soldering iron, and then that lets the heat transfer work much more quicker and much more easier. Something to keep in mind, a lot of people don't know this, but having solder on your iron is what really makes that heat transfer work very effortlessly. So the job is done right now. Take a look at it. You can see all the solder is kind of off those pads right now. One important thing to do is after you're done, make sure you examine it, because if you look closely, there's still some solder left on that pin. So make sure you always double check before you proceed with moving the stick box. Right now I'm just looking closer at it to see where it's at, and now I'm going to apply the last bit of solder wick to that part so we can take off that last bit of solder, and then we can proceed with removing the stick box. So if you notice, I usually dip my soldering iron into the coil, and the reason why I do that is because it cleans off the excess solder. If you leave solder on for too long, it could oxidize and ruin the tip. So doing that just removes all that excess solder and helps to make your tip last much longer. So now that that's done, we're going to begin by removing the stick box. Since all solder is off, we're going to use a pair of pliers. When using it, make sure you don't use too much pressure. Just lightly push down on those pins, and then it'll kind of just pop right out at the socket. And don't put too much pressure, just very lightly. Once it's out there, then you can just take it off with your fingers. Be careful, because I hurt myself there. The pins are pretty sharp. So here's a stick box. I believe this is a T2. Looking very boxy and very squarey. So this is the PCB board without the stick box. You can see it's just a bunch of holes. Right now what we're going to do is we're going to clean it, but that's up to you. You can wait till the end to clean it, or you can just do it now if you just don't like looking at that kind of mess. So we're going to use isopropyl alcohol. Again, you can wait to the end if you want to clean it, but for me, we're going to just do it right now. Make sure that when you're using isopropyl alcohol, you're using 99% pure. Anything less might have just too much water inside of it, and then it could end up, corroding your controller, destroying it, or even shorting it out. So once you get the alcohol, just apply a lot around there. Don't put too much, just make sure it covers up the entire area. Then we're going to use an electrical brush to clean off all that flux. Another important thing to do is that make sure you apply some alcohol into the R slider. The reason being is that sometimes some flux can slip into the R slider and then end up jamming it and making it very hard to move. So make sure after you done cleaning out the flux, you also apply isopropyl alcohol into there. And don't worry about it, it should dry off pretty fast. Just make sure that you apply a lot so that it can just kill all the flux that's inside, and you won't have any kind of jamming issues down the line. So now I'm just using a Q-tip to clean off those last bits of flux that's left on there. And look at that. All the flux is cleaned off, and look how clean it looks now. And this is the new stick box, a T3 stick box. You can just see that it doesn't have the 4 outer ground pins that the older one had. So we're going to make some modifications to those 2 bumps in the middle over there so we can fit that onto the older PCB board for T2 stick boxes. So we're just going to take a sander, we're going to file down those 2 little blobs right there. So right now we're going to take off those 2 potentiometers from the side. You can just use your fingernail to rip it off. Don't worry about it, it's very easy to apply it back on. And we're going to just take that nail filer and we're going to just sand down those 2 bumps. We're going to try to make it as flat as possible so it can just fit snug and very nicely on the board. And there we go. Now that it's flat, I put those 2 potentiometers back. Make sure that when you put it back, you move the analog stick and see those little 2 rotators moving to let you know that you put it back correctly and they're moving. as you're supposed to. So it's easy to put it back on, it just snaps right back on and then it's good to go. So now that we're finally done with that, we're gonna apply some flux, yeah, again onto those pins. So we're just gonna apply the flux onto those three pins that you see that are like just together. You're gonna apply in those 3 pins and the other 3 pins. You don't have to apply it to the 4 outer pins because it doesn't use that, this stick box. So that's how it looks like. You can see it's nice and saturated on there. So there's a lot of different ways you can try to hold the stick box in while you're soldering it. Some people will just solder 1 pin to hold it in place and then just apply the rest. Me, what I do is I just use the weight of the board to hold it in place, and then from there I just really just solder it on. This is an easy part. All you gotta do is just apply solder to your soldering iron and then just put it right on those pins. Don't worry about the thickness of your soldering iron. The reason the flux is there is to help the solder flow onto the pads themselves and not anything else. That's why it's very important to use flux, and it makes it much more easier to apply the solder on it. So make sure when you're doing this, you don't create any kind of bridges, you don't use any kind of excess solder on the pins themselves, because if there's excess solder, it could potentially contact the other pin, and if it contacts the other pin, you could short out the controller, or you could just shut down the switch or the GameCube, because it's going to detect this as a short inside the controller. So make sure when you're doing this, you're examining it, you're making sure that there's just enough solder to hold the pin in place, but not enough to contact the other pin. As you use a soldering iron on those pins, the flux will evaporate away, and it might get to the point where there's no flux left on the board, and might not be enough solder on the pins. If you do come across that, make sure you apply more flux, so then when you do it again, it'll just flow right on there, and it'll be easy to work. Just use flux. Use a lot of flux. Flux is really good. I don't know how you can do this without flux. So this is the flux that I use, MG Chemicals. This is flux paste. Some people use flux syringes that just have flux inside, and then you can just pump it out. This is the flux syringe right here. Some people also have flux pens. You could use that, but I never had good experiences with them. I just personally like to use flux paste. It's easy to apply and gets the job done. So once you're done, make sure you give a good inspection on the stick box. Make sure that it's nice and flat on the PCB board. And then afterwards, once you see that it's flat, you're gonna check the back and make sure that the solder is nice and evenly applied on all those pins. You can see there's no connections, no bridges, no shorts. It just looks pretty good, and I know it's going to be working. So finally, we're going to get to the last part. We're going to apply the capacitor on the stick box. We're going to apply it into the rightmost pin and the middle pin. Those 2 pins are the ones that take the capacitor. Once you put it on there, it'll help to alleviate the snapback that you get. But this is the kit that I use. It comes with a sorted amount of capacitors. These are mostly ceramic, so polarity won't matter, and they have a lot of different resistances. Since this is a T3 stick box, I'm going to go with a much more weaker capacitance. I'll say about 100 nanofarads. That should be good enough just to alleviate any kind of snapback that you would get on the newer stick boxes. The amount you use depends on how bad the snapback is. Usually it'll take trial and error to see what kind of amount you have to use. But I'm going through an experience, and what I've seen is that usually these kind of stick boxes will take 100 nanofarads perfectly fine. So I wouldn't recommend doing it this way, but I've just done it this way for so long. What I do is I'll hold the legs onto those 2 pins and then melt the solder onto it. So then once it melts, it'll just kind of just seep right in there, and then once you let go, it'll just connect to the pins. Make sure you also apply flux so that it could just help with the connection. Once you see that solder is melted, you can just quickly put those little 2 legs in there, and then you'll be good to go. So as you can see here, it looks like it's nicely connected. Make sure you push it around and pull it, not too much, but just enough to make sure that it's nicely snug and connected on there. Make sure there's no bridges, make sure there's no gaps, and once you do that, we can finally just clean off the last bit of flux left on there, and then we can get forward with assembling the controller, and then we'll test it out. Once again, I'm just dipping my Q-tip into the isopropyl alcohol just so I can clean off those last bits of flux that's left like on those corners and stuff and make it look shiny and brand spanking new. So finally, we're gonna just clean off the analog stick. You can see it looks a little dirty. So the first thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put some alcohol on the top part of the thumbstick. and I'm gonna just put that there, and I'm gonna use a Q-tip to kind of rub off that brown dirt that's on there. Afterwards, I'm gonna use a Q-tip to clean off those little sides and like the neck of the analog stick, and then I'm gonna use the hard side of the Q-tip just to take off those the dirt on the corners of the analog stick. So here I'm just applying some silicone dielectric grease. What that does is it makes the stick box much more smoother. It makes it feel much more like, kind of like it glides. So we're just gonna put it inside the stick box. We're gonna move the notch down, and we're gonna put one on each side. We're gonna put it on the top side, and then I'm gonna put it on the bottom side. Put some on the bottom, and then once you apply on both sides, just rotate it a lot, and then that helps to basically move all the grease around the stick box. Make sure that you don't apply too much, because then it could actually kind of mess with it and make it feel not good. Just put just enough to make it, you know, kind of dissolve inside the stick box, and it'll be very good when you start using it. So now I'm just gonna put the analog stick back onto the stick box, and then I'm gonna give it a quick inspection to make sure that everything looks okay. Just rotating it to make sure that it's good, and then we're gonna give it like a quick look right now. You can see how clean it looks now, making sure that the analog stick is touching the edges of the PCB board to make sure that it's going around all angles. And that's it. This is the silicone dielectric grease that I'm talking about. You could buy it from Amazon also. Finally, we're going to give it one last good clean before we assemble it back together. And that's it. I'm just testing out the buttons, making sure that they work. After this, I plug it into my switch and it works perfectly fine. I didn't experience any snapback, so that's great. Well, hopefully the person will be happy once they get the controller back. If you have any kind of inquiries about controller repair, you want to send it in, hit up my Twitter or my Gmail. If you guys have any kind of questions, just ask at the bottom and I'll try to get to them as soon as I can. Thank you for watching, and that's it. Next video we'll do something else, I guess.